Speed. I am speed. No, for me it should be art. I am art. Uh, Day in and day out, just drawing. Either community service, art stream, commission stream, doodle streams. This a lot. Morning, Melody. All right, enough nonsense. Let's go ahead and get started. This is where we left off yesterday with the skunk design, and then I had to get busy doing other things. Do 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 do. Oh yeah, let me pull up that. Horror baby. Horror baby. Close these windows because I don't need them. Pause this guy. Set quality. Close that window. Okay. Time has started. Sweet. All right, let's go. Let us go. No, I don't need this window either.
Rules of his parentage, inbreeding. Armitage muttered half aloud to himself. Great God, what simpletons! Show them Arthur Macon's great God Pan, and they'll think it a common Dunwich scandal. But what thing, what cursed shapeless influence on or off this three-dimensional earth was Wilbur Whately's father? Born on Candlemas, 9 months after May Eve of 1912, when the talk about the queer earth noises reached clear to Arkham, what walked on the mountains that May night? What rude mass horror fastened itself on the world in half-human flesh and blood? During the ensuing weeks, Dr. Armitage set about to collect all possible data on Wilbur Whately and the formless presences around Dunwich. He got in communication with Dr. Horton of Aylesbury, who had attended old Whately in his last illness, and found much to ponder over in the grandfather's last words, as quoted by the physician. A visit to Dunwich village failed to bring out much that was new, but a close survey of the Necronomicon in those parts which Wilbur had sought so avidly seemed to supply new and terrible clues to the nature, methods, and desires of the strange evil so vaguely threatening this planet.
Oh,
Talks with several students of archaic lore in Boston, and letters from many others elsewhere, gave him a growing amazement, which passed slowly through varied degrees of alarm to a state of really acute spiritual fear. As the summer drew on, he felt dimly that something ought to be done about the lurking terrors of the upper Miskatonic Valley, and about the monstrous being known to the human world as Wilbur Whately. 6. The Dunwich horror itself came between Lammas and the equinox in 1928, and Dr. Armitage was among those who witnessed its monstrous prologue. He had heard, meanwhile, of Whately's grotesque trip to Cambridge, and of his frantic efforts to borrow or copy from the Necronomicon at the Widener Library. Those efforts had been in vain, since Armitage had issued warnings of the keenest intensity to all librarians having charge of the dreaded volume. Wilbur had been shockingly nervous at Cambridge, anxious for the book, yet almost equally anxious to get home again, as if he feared the results of being away long. Early in August, the half-expected outcome developed, and in the small hours of the 3rd, Dr. Armitage was awakened suddenly by the wild, fierce cries of the savage watchdog on the college campus. Deep and terrible, the snarling, half-mad growls and barks continued, always in mounting volume, but with hideously significant pauses. Then there rang out a scream from a wholly different threat, such a scream as roused half the sleepers of Arkham and haunted their dreams ever afterwards. Such a scream as could come from no being born of earth, or wholly of earth. Armitage, hastening into some clothing and rushing across the street and lawn to the college buildings, saw that others were ahead of him and heard the echoes of a burglar alarm still shrilling from the library. An open window showed black and gaping in the moonlight. What had come had indeed completed its entrance, for the barking and the screaming, now fast fading into a mixed low growling and moaning, proceeded unmistakably from within. Some instinct warned Armitage that what was taking place was not a thing for unfortified eyes to see, so he brushed back the crowd with authority as he unlocked the vestibule door. Among the others, he saw Professor Warren Rice and Dr. Francis Morgan, men to whom he had told some of his conjectures and misgivings, and these two he motioned to accompany him inside. The inward sounds, except for a watchful droning whine from the dog,
Oh,
had by this time quite subsided.
I didn't.
But
I didn't get in
Armitage
touch
now
with them. I didn't
perceived
send
with
them a
a sudden
preview.
start that a loud chorus of whippoorwills among the shrubbery had commenced a damnably rhythmical piping, as if in unison with the last
I gotta
notes of a
export a
dying man.
preview and then send it to him sometime
The
today.
building was
Oh
full of a
gosh, I
frightful
forgot.
stench, which Dr. Armitage knew too well, and the three men rushed across the hall to the small genealogical reading room, whence the low whining came. For a second, nobody dared to turn on the light. Then Armitage summoned up his courage and snapped the switch. One of the three, it is not certain which, shrieked aloud at what sprawled
And Modi
before
says,
them
and
among
this is why
disordered
I'm your
tables
secretary.
and overturned
Yeah.
chairs. Professor Rice
Oh,
declares that he
jeez.
wholly lost consciousness
I'm
for an instant,
drooling on
though he
myself.
did not stumble or fall. The thing that lay half bent on its side in a fetid pool of greenish-yellow ichor and tarry stickiness was almost 9 feet tall, and the dog had torn off all the clothing and some of the skin. It was not quite dead, but twitched silently and spasmodically while its chest heaved in monstrous unison with the mad piping of the expectant whippoorwills outside.
Okay, hold on.
Bits of shoe leather and fragments of apparel were scattered about
Let
the
us
room,
go
and
ahead
just inside the
and
window an empty canvas sack
message
lay
that
where it had
guy.
evidently been thrown. Near the central desk a revolver had fallen, a dented but undischarged cartridge later explaining why it had not been fired. The thing itself, however, crowded out all other images at the time. It would be trite and not wholly accurate to say
Totally
that no
spaced
human
it.
pen could describe it. But one
Okay.
may properly say that it could not be vividly visualized by anyone whose ideas of aspect and
25%
contour
rate.
are too closely bound up with the common life forms of this planet and of the three known dimensions. It was partly human, beyond a doubt, with very man-like hands and head, and the goatish, chinless face had the stamp of the weightless upon it. But the torso and lower parts of the body were
Totally
teratologically
forgot
fabulous, so
to
that only generous
send you
clothing could
this
ever have
update
enabled it
for
to
your
walk on Earth
approval.
unchallenged or uneradicated. Above the waist was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest, where the dog's rending paws still rested watchfully, had the leathery, reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald with yellow and black, and dimly suggested the squamous covering of certain snakes. Below the waist, though, it was the worst, for here all human resemblance left off and sheer fantasy began. The skin was thickly covered with coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long,
I
greenish-gray
thought I was waiting
tentacles
on your
with red
approval, but
sucking
really I was
mouths protruded limply.
waiting
Their
on me to
arrangement
send it.
was odd, and seemed to
Waiting
follow the
for me
symmetries of some
to send
cosmic
it.
geometry unknown to Earth or the solar system.
There we
On
go.
each of the hips, deep set in a kind of pinkish ciliated orbit, was what seemed to be a rudimentary eye, whilst in
Okay.
lieu of a tail
All
there
right.
depended
Message
a kind of
sent.
trunk or feeler with purple annular
Okay.
markings, and with
Let
many
us skip
evidences of
that.
being an undeveloped mouth or throat. The limbs, save for their black fur, roughly resembled the hind legs of prehistoric Earth's giant saurians, and terminated in ridgy veined pads that were neither hooves nor claws. When the thing breathed, its tail and tentacles rhythmically changed color, as if from some circulatory cause normal to the non-human side of its ancestry. In the tentacles, this was observable as a deepening of the greenish tinge, whilst in the tail it was manifest as a yellowish appearance which alternated with a sickly greyish white in the spaces between the purple rings. Of genuine blood there was none, only the fetid greenish yellow ichor which trickled along the painted floor beyond the radius of the stickiness and left a curious discoloration behind it. As the presence of the three men seemed to rouse the dying thing, it began to mumble without turning or raising its head. Dr. Armitage made no written record of its mouthings, but asserts confidently that nothing in English was uttered. At first the syllables defied all correlation with any speech of earth, but towards the last there came some disjointed fragments evidently taken from the Necronomicon, that monstrous blasphemy in quest of which the thing had perished. These fragments, as Armitage recalls them, ran something like Nagai, Naga, Ga, Bug, Shagog, Yaha, Yogsototh, Yogsototh. They trailed off into nothingness as the whippoorwills shrieked in rhythmical crescendos of unholy anticipation. Then came a halt in the gasping, and the dog raised its head in a long, lugubrious howl. A change came over the yellow, goatish face of the prostrate thing, and the great black eyes fell in appallingly. Outside the window, the shrilling of the whippoorwills had suddenly ceased, and above the murmurs of the gathering crowd there came
He
the
looks too
echo
evil
of a
right here.
panic-struck whirring and fluttering. Against the moon-vast clouds of feathery watchers rose and raced from sight,
Let's not
frantic
make him look
as
so
they sought
wicked.
for prey. All at once the dog started up abruptly, gave a frightened bark, and leaped nervously out of the window by which it had entered. A cry rose from the crowd, and Dr. Armitage shouted to the men outside that no one must be admitted till the police or medical
What
examiner
is
came.
that dog
He was
barking
thankful
at?
that the windows were just too high to permit of peering in, and drew the dark curtains
Ugh.
carefully down over each one. By this time, two policemen had arrived, and Dr. Morgan, meeting them in the vestibule, was urging them for their own sakes to postpone entrance to the stench-filled reading room till the examiner came and the prostrate thing could be covered up. Meanwhile, frightful changes were taking place on the floor. One need not describe the kind and rate of shrinkage and disintegration that occurred before the eyes of Dr. Armitage and Professor Rice, but it is permissible
I guess
to
she
say
was
that,
barking at
aside from the
some
external
bird?
appearance of face and hands, the really human element in Wilbur Whately must have been very small.
Ugh. Oh
When the
yeah,
medical examiner came, there
gotta
was
take my
only a sticky, whitish
antibiotics.
mass on the painted boards, and the monstrous odor had nearly disappeared. Apparently, Whately had had no skull or bony skeleton,
Oh, maybe my
at least
brother's
in
feeding
any
them.
true or stable sense.
They can
He
hear the
had
dog
taken
food
somewhat
getting
after
poured, so
his
then they get
unknown
excited.
part. 7. Yet
And let
all
me
this
take
was only the
some
prologue to the
ibuprofen
actual
for my
downward horror. Formalities were gone through by bewildered
pain and
officials,
swelling.
abnormal details were duly kept from press and public, and men were sent to Dunwich and Aylesbury to look up property and notify any who might be heirs of the late Wilbur
There we
Whately.
go.
They found the countryside in great agitation, both because of
Yeah,
the
that
growing
face was
rumblings
too
beneath Stone Hill, and
mischievous.
because of the unwanted stench and the surging, lapping sounds which came increasingly from the great empty shell formed by
Downright
Whately's
sinister.
boarded-up farmhouse. Earl Sawyer, who tended the horse and cattle during Wilbur's absence, had developed a woefully acute case of nerves. The officials devised excuses not to enter the noisome boarded place, and were glad to confine their survey of the deceased's living quarters, the newly mended sheds, to a single visit. They filed a ponderous report at the courthouse in Aylesbury, and litigations concerning heirship are said to be still in progress amongst the innumerable Whateleys, decayed and undecayed, of the upper Miskatonic Valley. An almost interminable manuscript in strange characters, written in a huge ledger and adjudged a sort of diary because of the spacing and the variations in ink and penmanship, presented a baffling puzzle to those who found it on the old bureau which served as its owner's desk. After a week of debate, it was sent to Miskatonic University, together with the deceased's collection of strange books, for study and possible translation. But even the best linguists soon saw that it was not likely to be unriddled with ease. No trace of the ancient gold, with which Wilbur and old Whately had always paid their debts, has yet been discovered. It was in the dark of September 9th that the horror broke loose. The hill noises had been very pronounced during the evening, and dogs barked frantically all night. Early risers on the 10th noticed a peculiar stench in the air. About 7 o'clock, Luther Brown, the hired boy at George Corey's, between Cold Spring Glen and the village, rushed frenziedly back from his morning trip to 10-acre Meadow with the cows. He was almost convulsed with fright as he stumbled into the kitchen, and in the yard outside the no less frightened herd were pawing and lowing pitifully, having followed the boy back in the panic they shared with him. Between gasps, Luther tried to stammer out his tale to Mrs. Corey. "Up there in the road beyond the glen, Miss Corey, there's something been there. It smells like thunder, and all the bushes and little trees is pushed back from the road like they'd a house been moved along of it. And that ain't the worst other. There's prints in the road, Miss Corey, great round prints as big as barrel heads, all sunk down deep like an elephant had been along, only there's a sign no 4 feet could make. I looked at one or two afore I run, and I see everyone was covered with lines spreading out from one place, like as if big palm leaf fans, twigged to 3 times as big as any they is, had been bounded down into the rud, and the smell was awful, like what is around Wizard Whaley's old house." Here he faltered, and seemed to shiver afresh with the fright that had sent him flying home. Mrs. Corey, unable to extract more information, began telephoning the neighbors, thus starting on its rounds the overture of panic that heralded the major terrors. When she got Sally Sawyer, housekeeper at Seth Bishop's, the nearest place to Whately's, it became her turn to listen instead of transmit. For Sally's boy, Chauncey, who slept poorly, had been up on the hill towards Whately's, and had dashed back in terror after one look at the place, and at the pasturage where Mr. Bishop's cows had been left out all night. "Yes, Miss Corey," came Sally's tremulous voice over the party wire. "Chauncey just come back a posting and couldn't half talk for being scared. He says all Whately's house is all blowed up, with timbers scattered round like there'd been dynamite inside, only the bottom floor ain't through, but it's all covered with a kind of tar-like stuff that smells awful and drips down off an edges onto the ground where the side timbers is blown away. And there's awful kind of marks in the yard too, great round marks bigger round than an hogshead, and all sticky with stuff like is on the blowed up house. Chauncey says they leads off into the meadows, where a great swath widen a barn is matted down, and all the stone walls tumbled every which way wherever it goes. And he says he, Miss Corey, as how he sought to look for Seth's cows, frightened as he was, and found 'em in the upper pasture nigh the devil's up yard in an awful shape. Half on 'em's clean gone, and nigh half of 'em that's left is sucked most dry of blood, with sores on 'em like there's been on Whately's cattle ever since Lavinia's black brat was born. Seth he's gone out now to look at 'em, though although he won't care to git very nigh Wizard Whately's. Chauncey didn't look careful to see what the big matted down swath let arter it left the pasturage, but he says he thinks it panted towards the Glen Road to the village. I tell ye, Miss Corey, there's something abroad as hadn't ought to be abroad, and I for one think that Black Wilbur Whately has come to the bad end he deserved, is at the bottom of the breeding of it. He wasn't all human hisself, I allus says to everybody, and I think old Whately must have raised something in that there nailed up house as ain't ever so human as he was. There's allus been unseen things around Dunwich, living things as ain't human and ain't good for human folks. The ground was a talking last night, and towards morning Chauncey heard the whippoorwill so loud in Cold Spring Glen he couldn't sleep them. Then he thought he heard another faint like sound off towards Wizard Whaley's, a kind of ripping or tearing of wood, like some big box or crate was being opened fur off. What with this and that, he didn't get to sleep at all till sun up, and no sooner was he up this morning but he's got to go over the Whately's and see what's the matter. He see enough, I tell you, Miss Corey. This don't mean no good, and I think as all the men folks ought to get up a party and do something. I know something awful's about, and feel my time is nigh, that only God knows just what it is. Did your Luther take account to where them big tracks led to? No. Well, Miss Corey, if they was on the Glen Road this side of the Glen and ain't got to your house yet, I calculate they must go into the Glen itself. They would do that. I allus says Cold Spring Glen ain't no healthy nor decent place. The whippoorwills and fireflies, they never did act like they was creators of God. And there's them as says you can hear strange things a rushing and a talking in the air down there if you stand in the right place, atween the rock falls and Bear's Den. By that noon, fully 3/4 of the men and boys of Dunwich were trooping over the roads and
I'm
meadows
thinking
between
that this
Dooney and
isn't the
Wakefield
same narrator that
Cold Spring
we
Glen,
introduced
examining
ourselves
with
to in
horror
one of the
vast monstrous prince
other
who
ones. Like,
reigned
I
bishop
think he
cattle.
sounds
There was
similar, but
noisome wreckage of the
there's just
farmhouse
something
and the
about
rude matted vegetation
how
from fields and
he
roadside. Whatever had burst
narrates.
loose upon
It's
the world had assuredly gone down
doesn't
into
hit
the
the
great
same richness
sinister
as that
ravine,
first
where
guy,
all the trees on the banks were
unless
bent and broken, and the great avenue had
unless
been
this is like one
gouged
of
in the
his
precipice by
first
new avenues.
narrations, just
It was
narrating
as though a house
this
launched
whole
by an
thing all the way
avalanche
through.
had slid down through the tangled growths of the almost vertical slope.
I don't
From
know.
below no sound came, but only a
Yeah,
distant, undefinable fetter. And it is not to be wondered at that the men preferred to stay on the edge and argue, rather than descend and beard the unknown cyclopean horror in its lair. 3 dogs that were with the
he
party had
does sound
barked
different,
furiously at
and he
first, but
does.
seemed calm and reluctant when near the glen. Someone telephoned
The
the
same.
news to the Aylesbury
Woo.
transcript, but the editor,
Excuse me.
accustomed to wild tales from Dunwich, did no more than concoct a humorous paragraph about it, an item soon afterwards reproduced by the Associated Press. That night everyone went home, and every house and barn was barricaded as stoutly as possible. Needless to say, no cattle were allowed to remain in open pasturage. About 2 in the morning, a
Yeah,
frightful
like
stench
I think
and the savage
thinking
barking
about
of
it,
the
it's like
dogs
this
awakened the
narration now
household at
seems
Elmer
like it's
Price,
kind of like
collectors
rushing
at the edge of
along,
Cold Spring
whereas the
Glen,
first one
and
we
all
listened
agreed that
to
they could hear a sort
last
of
night,
muffled
it was
swishing
like
or lapping sound from somewhere else.
it took its
Mrs.
time to
Fry
like allow
proposed
you to
telephoning the
dwell on what
neighbours,
he was
and Elmer
saying,
was about to agree when the noisy
and the way he
splintering
would
wood
narrate
burst
had
in
like
upon
the rhythm.
deliberations.
It would
It
catch
came,
the rhythm of the
apparently,
writing.
from the barn, and was quickly followed by a
That
hideous
just kind of like
stirring and stamping amongst the cattle.
allowed
The dogs
everything to just like
slabbered and
settle
crouched
into
close
your
to the
mind.
feet of the fear-numbed family. Fry lit a lantern through force of habit, but knew
So
it would be death to go out into that black
comparing the
forest.
two, like this one
The
feels
children
like
and the
it's kind of like
womenfolk whimpered,
rushing
kept from
along a bit.
screaming by some obscure vestigial instinct
Yeah,
of defense, which told them their lives
this sounds like the
depended
same
on
guy, but he's
silence.
speed reading.
At last,
Yet,
the noise of the cattle subsided to a pitiful moaning, and a great snapping, crashing, and crackling ensued. The Frys, huddled together in the sitting room, did not dare to move until the last echoes died away far down in Cold Spring Glen. Then, amidst the dismal moans from the stable and the demoniac piping of the late whippoorwills in the glen, Selina Fry tottered to the telephone and spread what news she could of the second phase of the horror. The next day, all the countryside was in a panic, and cowed, uncommunicative groups came and went where the fiendish thing had occurred. 2 titan swaths of destruction stretched from the glen to the Fry farmyard. Monstrous prints covered the bare patches of ground, and one side of the old red barn had completely caved in. Of the cattle, only a quarter could be found and identified. Some of these were in curious fragments, and all that survived had to be shot. Old Sawyer suggested that help be asked from Aylesbury or Arkham, but others maintained it would be of no use. Old Zebulon Whately, of a branch that hovered about halfway between soundness and decadence, made darkly wild suggestions about rites that ought to be practiced on the hilltops. He came of a line where tradition ran strong, and his memories of chantings in the great stone circles were not altogether connected with Wilbur and his grandfather. Darkness fell upon a stricken countryside, too passive to organize for real defense. In a few cases, closely related families would band together and watch in the gloom under one roof. But in general, there was only a repetition of the barricading of the night before, and a futile, ineffective gesture of loading muskets and setting pitchforks handily about. Nothing, however, occurred except some hill noises, and when the day came, there were many who hoped that the new horror had gone as swiftly as it had come. There were even bold souls who proposed an offensive expedition down in the glen, though they did not venture to set an actual example to the still reluctant majority. When night came again, the barricading was repeated, though there was less huddling together of families. In the morning, both the Fry and the Seth Bishop households reported excitement among the dogs and vague sounds and stenches from afar, while early explorers noted with horror a fresh set of the monstrous tracks in the road skirting Sentinel Hill. As before, the sides of the road showed a bruising indicative of the blasphemously stupendous bulk of the horror, whilst the conformation of the tracks seemed to argue a passage in two directions, as if the moving mountain had come from Cold Spring Glen and returned to it along the same path. At the base of the hill, a 30-foot swath of crushed shrubbery saplings led steeply upwards, and the seekers gasped when they saw that even the most perpendicular places did not deflect the inexorable trail. Whatever the horror was, it could scale a sheer stony cliff
Oh, my
with
tablet's
almost
blinking
complete
out.
verticality, and as the investigators climbed round
Come
to the
on.
hill's summit by
All right, there
safer
we go.
routes, they saw that the trail ended, or rather, reversed, there. It was here that the Wakeleys used to build their hellish fires and chant their hellish rituals by the table-like stone on May Eve and Hallowmas. Now that very stone formed the centre of a vast space thrashed around by the mountainous horror, whilst upon its slightly concave surface was a thick and fetid deposit of the same tarry stickiness observed on the floor of the ruined Whately farmhouse when the horror escaped. Men looked at one another and muttered. Then they looked down the hill. Apparently the horror had descended by a route much the same as that of its ascent. To speculate was futile. Reason, logic, and normal ideas of motivation stood confounded. Only old Zebulon, who was not with the group, could have done justice to the situation or suggested a plausible explanation. Thursday night began much like the others, but it ended less happily. The whippoorwills in the glen had screamed with such unusual persistence that many could not sleep, and about 3 a.m. all the party telephones rang tremulously. Those who took down their receivers heard a fright-mad voice shriek out, "Help! Oh, my God!" And some thought a crashing sound followed the breaking off of the exclamation. There was nothing more. No one dared do anything, and no one knew till morning whence the call came. Then those who had heard it called everyone on the line and found that only the Frys did not reply. The truth appeared an hour later, when a hastily assembled group of armed men trudged out to the Fry place at the
Yeah,
head
you
of the
heard her,
hill.
Tablet.
It was
Moses,
possible,
behave yourself.
yet hardly a surprise.
Ah!
There were more swaths, a monstrous print, but there was no longer any house. It had caved in like an eggshell, and amongst the ruins nothing living or dead could be discovered. Only a stench and a tarry stickiness. The Elmer Frys had been erased from Dunwich. A. In the meantime, a quieter yet even more spiritually poignant phase of the horror had been blackly unwinding itself behind the closed door of a shelf-lined room in Arkham. The curious manuscript record or diary of Wilbur Whately, delivered to Miskatonic University for translation, had caused much worry and bafflement among the experts in language both ancient and modern. Its very alphabet, notwithstanding the general resemblance to the heavily shaded Arabic used in Mesopotamia, being absolutely unknown to any available authority. The final conclusion of the linguists was that the text represented an artificial alphabet, giving the effect of a cipher, though none of the usual methods of cryptographic solution seemed to furnish any clue, even when applied on the basis of every tongue the writer might conceivably have used. The ancient books taken from Whately's quarters, while absorbing interest and in several cases promising to open up new and terrible lines of research among philosophers and men of science, were of no assistance whatever in this matter. One of them, a heavy tome with an iron clasp, was in another unknown alphabet. This one of a very different cast, and resembling Sanskrit more than anything else. The old ledger was at length given wholly into the charge of Dr. Armitage, both because of his peculiar interest in the Whately matter, and because of his wide linguistic learning and skill in the mystical formulae of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Armitage had an idea that the alphabet might be something esoterically used by certain forbidden cults which have come down from old times, and which have inherited many forms and traditions from the wizards of the Saracenic world. That question, however, he did not deem vital, since it would be unnecessary to know the origin of the symbols if, as he suspected, they were used as a cipher in a modern language. It was his belief that, considering the great amount of text involved, the writer would scarcely have wished the trouble of using another speech than his own, save perhaps in certain special formulae and incantations. Accordingly, he attacked the manuscript with the preliminary assumption that the bulk of it was in English. Dr. Armitage knew, from the repeated failures of his colleagues, that the riddle was a deep and complex one, and that no simple mode of solution could merit even a trial. All through late August, he fortified himself with the mass lore of cryptography, drawing upon the fullest resources of his own library, and waiting night after night amidst the arcana of Trimethis's Holographia, Giambattista Porta's De
Oh, it
Furta
says
Vista
30 minutes
Para
done
Remotus,
already. Sweet.
Divigideon's Trait to
You know what
Shifting,
this calls for?
Falconer's
A smoke
Cryptomenasis
break.
Patafacta, Davis's and Thickness's
I
18th
know
century
it
treatises,
seems like I take a
and
lot of
such
smoke
fairly
breaks, but
modern authorities
I'm
as
just
Blair,
smoking up like the same cigarette. Like I'll take a few puffs.
he interspersed his
So it's not
studies
like
with
I'm chain
repeated attacks
smoking
on the
or anything.
manuscript itself,
Because
and
like
in
throughout the
time
day, I'm
became
just
convinced
puffing
that
on
he
the
had to deal
same
with one of
cigarette.
the subtlest and most ingenious of cryptograms, in which many separate lists of corresponding letters are arranged like the multiplication table, and the message built up with arbitrary keywords known only to the initiated. The older authorities seemed rather more helpful than the newer ones, and Armitage concluded that the code of the manuscript was one of great antiquity, no doubt handed down through a long line of mystical experimenters. Several times he seemed near daylight, only to be set back by some
Do, do,
unforeseen
do,
obstacle.
do.
Then, as September approached, the clouds began to clear.
Besides, it's Friday.
Certain letters, as used in certain parts of the manuscript, emerged definitely and unmistakably, and it became obvious that the text was indeed in English. On the evening of September 2nd, the last major barrier gave way, and Dr. Armitage read for the first time a continuous passage of Wilbur Whately's Annals. It was in truth a diary, as all had thought, and it was couched in a style clearly showing the mixed occult erudition and general illiteracy of the strange being who wrote it. Almost the first long passage that Armitage deciphered, an entry dated November 26th,
Okay, concerning their
1916,
narrations, like,
proved
who's
highly
this guy
striking
now?
in his triumphs. It was written,
It's like it sounds like the same
by a
guy,
child of 3 and a
but
half,
he's
who
like
looked like a lad
reading
of
it
12 or
different,
13. Today learned the ACLO for the
almost
Sabbath.
like closer
It
to
read,
what we heard
which did
yesterday.
not like, it being
So I
anthropos in the
think
hill and
as
not
he's going
made
through
on it,
this voice,
that I
I'm
declare more
wondering,
eloquently than I had thought it would
like
do,
this is if
and
this
it
is
was
one of his
because
first
of my
readings, and
birth
he's like
among
going through this
shot even
book, these
Hutches's Polly
books,
Jack when he went
just kind of
beside me, and
finding his
realized that
narrator's
he would
voice,
kill me if
maybe.
he'd asked. I guess he won't. Grandfather kept me saying the Doe formula last night, and I think I saw the inner city at the two magnetic poles. I shall go to those poles when the earth is cleared off, if I can't break through with the Doe formula when I commit it. Dave from the air told me at Sabat that it will be years before I can clear off the earth, and I guess Grandfather will be dead then, so I shall have to learn all the angles of the planes and all the formulas between the Ur and the Nahunga. They from outside will help, but they cannot take bodies
Yeah,
without human blood. That
he hasn't
upstairs
found
looks
his
as if it
story
had the
rhythm
right
yet.
cast. I can see it a little when I make
Yeah,
the
like
voyage
I
sign
get that
or blow the
sense.
powder of Ibn Ghazi at it. And it is near like them at May Eve on the hill. The other face may wear off some. I wonder how I shall look when the earth is cleared and there are no earth beings on it. He that came with the Aklos about said I may be transfigured, there being much outside to work on. Morning found Dr. Armitage in a cold sweat of terror and a frenzy of wakeful concentration. He had not left the manuscript all night, but sat at his table under the electric light, turning page after page, with shaking hands as fast as he could decipher the cryptic text. He had nervously telephoned his wife he would not be home, and when she brought him a breakfast from the house, he could scarcely dispose of a mouthful. All that day he read on, now and then halted maddeningly as a reapplication of the complex key became necessary. Lunch and dinner were brought him, but he ate only the smallest fraction of either. Toward the middle of the next night he drowsed off in his chair, but soon woke out of a tangle of nightmares almost as hideous as the truths and menaces to man's existence that he had uncovered. On the morning of September 4th, Professor Rice and Dr. Morgan insisted on seeing him for a while, and departed trembling and ashen grey. That evening he went to bed, but slept only fitfully. Wednesday, the next day, he was back at the manuscript, and began to take copious notes both from the current sections and from those he had already deciphered. In the small hours of that night he slept a little in an easy chair in his office, but was at the manuscript again before dawn. Some time before noon his physician, Dr. Hartwell, called to see him and insisted that he cease work. He refused, intimating that it was of the most vital importance for him to complete the reading of the diary and promising an explanation in due course of time. That evening, just as twilight fell, he finished his terrible perusal and sank back exhausted. His wife, bringing his dinner, found him in a half-comatose state, but he was conscious enough to warn her off with a sharp cry when he saw her eyes wander toward the notes he had taken. Weakly rising, he gathered up the scribbled papers and sealed them all in a great envelope, which he immediately placed in his inside coat pocket. He had sufficient strength to get home, but was so clearly in need of medical aid that Dr. Hartwell was summoned at once. As the doctor put him to bed, he could only mutter over and over again,
Okay.
"But what, in God's name, can we do?" Dr. Armitage slept, but was partly delirious the next day.
This
He
morning
made
isn't
no
as cold as
explanations
some of
to
the other
Hartwell,
ones, but we'll
but in his
see.
calmer moments spoke of the imperative need of a long conference with Rice and Morgan. His wilder wanderings were very startling indeed, including frantic appeals that something in a boarded-up farmhouse be destroyed, and fantastic references to some plan for the extirpation of the entire human race and all animal and vegetable life from the earth by some terrible elder race of beings from another dimension. He would shout that the world was in danger, since the elder things wished to strip it and drag it away from the solar system and cosmos of matter into some other plane or phase of entity from which it had once fallen, by gentillions of aeons ago. At other times he would call for the dreaded Necronomicon and the Demonolatreia of Remigius, in which he seemed hopeful of finding some formula to check the peril he conjured up. "Stop them! Stop them!" he would shout. "Those Whateleys meant to let them in, and the worst of all is left. Tell Rice and Morgan we must do something. It's a blind business, but I know how to make the powder. It hasn't been fed since the 2nd of August, when Wilbur came here to his death, and at that rate—" But Armitage had a sound physique, despite his 73 years, and slept off his disorder that night without developing any real fever. He woke late Friday, clear of head, though sober with a gnawing fear and tremendous sense of responsibility. Saturday afternoon he felt able to go over to the library and summon Rice and Morgan for a conference, and the rest of that day and evening the three men tortured their brains in the wildest speculation and the most desperate debate. Strange and terrible books were drawn voluminously from the stacked shelves and from secure places of storage, and diagrams and formulae were copied with feverish haste and in bewildering abundance. Of skepticism there was none. All three had seen the body of Wilbur Whately as it lay on the floor in a room of that very building, and after that not one of them could feel even slightly inclined to treat the diary as a madman's raving. Opinions were divided as to notifying the Massachusetts State Police, and the negative finally won. There were things involved which simply could not be believed by those who had not seen a sample, as indeed was made clear during certain subsequent investigations. Late at night the conference disbanded without having developed a definite plan, but all day Sunday Armitage was busy comparing formulae and mixing chemicals obtained from the college laboratory. The more he reflected on the hellish diary, the more he was inclined to doubt the efficacy of any material agent in stamping out the entity which Wilbur Whately had left behind him, the earth-threatening entity which, unknown to him, was to burst forth in a few hours and become the memorable Dunwich Horror. Monday was a repetition of Sunday with Dr. Armitage, for the task in hand required an infinity of research and experiment. Further consultations of the monstrous diary brought about various changes of plan, and he knew that even in the end a large amount of uncertainty must remain. By Tuesday, he had a definite line of action mapped out and believed he would try a trip to Dunwich within a week. Then, on Wednesday, the great shock came. Tucked obscurely away in a corner of the Arkham Advertiser was a facetious little item from the Associated Press, telling what a record-breaking monster the bootleg whiskey of Dunwich had raised up. Armitage, half stunned, could only telephone for Rice and Morgan. Far into the night they discussed, and the next day was a whirlwind of preparation on the part of them all. Armitage knew he would be meddling with terrible powers, yet saw that there was no way to annul the deeper and more malign meddling which others had done before him. 9. Friday morning, Armitage, Rice, and Morgan set out by motor for Dunwich, arriving at the village about 1 in the afternoon. The day was pleasant, but even in the brightest sunlight a kind of quiet dread and portent seemed to hover about the strangely domed hills and the deep, shadowy ravines of the stricken region. Now and then on some mountain top a gaunt circle of stones could be glimpsed against the sky. From the air of hushed fright at Osborne's store they knew something hideous had happened, and soon learned of the annihilation of the Elmer Fry house and family. Throughout that afternoon they rode around Dunwich, questioning the natives concerning all that had occurred, and seeing
I gotta get up and
with
stretch.
rising pangs of horror the drear Fry ruins with their lingering traces of the tarry stickiness, the blasphemous tracks in the Fry yard, the wounded Bishop cattle, and the enormous swaths of disturbed vegetation in various places. The trail up and down Sentinel Hill seemed to Armitage of almost cataclysmic significance, and he looked long at the sinister altar-like stone on the side. At length the visitors, apprised of a party of state police which had come from Aylesbury that morning in response to the first telephone reports of the Fry tragedy, decided to seek out the officers and compare notes as far as practicable. This, however, they found more easily planned than performed, since no sign of the party could be found in any direction. There had been 5 of them in a car, but now the car stood empty near the ruins in the Fry yard. The natives, all of whom had talked with the policeman, seemed at first as perplexed as Armitage and his companions. Then old Sam Hopkins thought of something and turned pale, nudging Fred Farr and pointing to the dank, deep hollow that yawned close by.
God,
He gasped.
I told him not to go down into the glen, and I never thought nobody'd do it with them tracks and that smell, and the whippoorwills are screeching down there in the dark and noonday.
A cold shudder ran through natives and visitors alike, and every ear seemed strained in a kind of instinctive, unconscious listening. Armitage, now that he had actually come upon the horror and its monstrous work, trembled with the responsibility he felt to be his. Night would soon fall, and it was then that the mountainous blasphemy lumbered upon its eldritch course. Negotium perambuiens in tenebris. The old librarian rehearsed the formulae he had memorized and clutched the paper containing the alternative one he had not memorized. He saw that his electric flashlight was in working order. Rice, beside him, took from a valise a metal sprayer of the sort used in combating insects, whilst Morgan uncased the big game rifle on which he relied, despite his colleague's warnings that no material weapon would be of help. Armitage, having read the hideous diary, knew painfully well what kind of a manifestation to expect, but he did not add to the fright of the Dunwich people by giving any hints or clues. He hoped that it might be conquered without any revelation to the world of the monstrous thing it had escaped. As the shadows gathered, the natives commenced to disperse homeward, anxious to bar themselves indoors, despite the present evidence that all human locks and bolts were useless before a force that could bend trees and crush houses when it chose. They shook their heads at the visitors' plan to stand guard at the Fry ruins near the glen, and, as they left, had little expectancy of ever seeing the watchers again. There were rumblings under the hills that night, and the whippoorwills piped threateningly. Once in a while a wind, sweeping up out of Cold Spring Glen, would bring a touch of ineffable fetor to the heavy night air, such a fetor as all 3 of the watchers had smelled once before, when they stood above a dying thing that had passed for 15 years and a half as a human being. but the looked-for terror did not appear. Whatever was down there in the glen was biding its time, and Armitage told his colleagues it would be suicidal to try to attack it in the dark. Morning came wanly, and the night sounds ceased. It was a grey, bleak day, with now and then a drizzle of rain, and heavier clouds seemed to be piling themselves up beyond the hills to the northwest. The men from Arkham were undecided what to do. Seeking shelter from the increasing rainfall beneath one of the few undestroyed Fry outbuildings, they debated the wisdom of waiting, or of taking the aggressive and going down into the glen in quest of their nameless, monstrous quarry. The downpour waxed in heaviness, and distant peals of thunder sounded from far horizons. Sheet lightning shimmered, and then a forky bolt flashed near at hand, as if descending into the accursed glen itself. The sky grew very dark, and the watchers hoped that the storm would prove a short, sharp one, followed by clear weather. It was still gruesomely dark when, not much over an hour later, a confused babble of voices sounded down the road. Another moment brought to view a frightened group of more than a dozen men, running, shouting, and even whimpering hysterically. Someone in the lead began sobbing out words, and the Arkham men started violently when those words developed a coherent form. "Oh, my God! My God!" the voice choked out. "It's a-going again, and this time by day. It's out, and a-moving this very minute. And only the Lord knows when it'll be on us all." The speaker panted into silence, but another took up his message.
"Nigh on an hour ago, Zeb Whately heard the phone a-ringing, and it was Miss Corey, George's wife, that lives down by the junction. She says the hired boy Luther was out driving in the cows from the storm out of the big boat, when he see all the trees a-bending at the mouth of the glen, opposite side to this, and smelt the same awful smell like he smelt when he found the big tracks last Monday morning. And he says, there was a swishing, lapping sound, more nor what the bending trees and bushes could make. And all on a sudden, the trees along the road began to get pushed one side, and there was an awful stomping and splashing in the mud. But mind ye, Luther, he didn't see nothing at all, only just the bending trees and underbrush. Then fur ahead, where Bishop's Brook goes under the road, he heard an awful creaking and straining on the bridge, and says he could tell the sound of wood a starting to crack and split. And all the whiles he never see a thing, only them trees and bushes a bending. And when the swishing sound got very far off, on the road towards Wizard Whately's and Sentinel Hill, Luther, he had the guts to step up where he'd heard it first and look at the ground. It was all mud and water, and the sky was dark, and the rain was wiping out all tracks about as fast as could be. But beginning at the glen now, where the trees he moved, there was still some of them awful print, big as boughs, like he seen Monday."
At this point, the first excited speaker interrupted. "But that ain't the trouble now. That was only the start. Zebby was calling folks up, and everybody was a-listening in when a call from Seth Bishop's cut in. His housekeeper, Sally, was carrying on fit to kill. She'd just seen the trees a-bending beside the road, and says there was a kind of mushy sound, like an elephant puffing and treading, heading for the house. Then she up and spoke sudden of a fearful smell, and says a boy Chancy was a-screaming, as how it was just like what he smelt up to the Whately ruins Monday morning, and the dogs was barking and whining awful. And then she let out a terrible yell, and says the shed down the road had just caved in like the storm had blowed it over, only the wind wasn't strong enough to do that. Everybody was a-listening, and we could hear lots of folks on the wire a-gasping. All to onk, Sally, she yelled again, and says the front yard picket fence had just crumbled up, though there wasn't no sign of what done it. Then everybody on the line could hear Chauncey and old Seth Bishop a-yelling too, and Sally was shrieking out that something heavy had struck the house. Not lightning or nothing, but something heavy again the front that kept a-launching itself again and again, though you couldn't see nothing out the front windows. And then... Lines of fright deepened on every face, and Armitage, shaken as he was, had barely poise enough to prompt the speaker. And then Sally, she yelled out, "Oh, help, the house is a-caving in," and on the wire we could hear a terrible crashing and a whole flock of screaming, just like when Elmer Fry's place was took, only worse. The man paused, and another of the crowd spoke.
1 hour, 10
That's
minutes
all.
remaining.
Not a sound nor
Thank you,
squeak
love.
over the thorn after that. Just still light. We that heard it got out Fords and wagons and rounded up as many able-bodied men folks as we could get at Corey's place, and come up here to see what you thought best to do. Not but what I think it's the Lord's judgment for our iniquities that no mortal can ever set aside. Armitage saw that the time for positive action had come, and spoke decisively to the faltering group of frightened rustics. We must follow it, boys. He made his voice as reassuring as possible. I believe there's a chance of putting it out of business. You men know that those Whateleys were wizards. Well, this thing is a thing of wizardry, and must be put down by the same means. I've seen Wilbur Whately's diary and read some of the strange old books he used to read, and I think I know the right kind of spell to recite to make the thing fade away. Of course, one can't be sure, but we can always take a chance. It's invisible. I knew it would be, but there's powder in this long-distance sprayer that might make it show up for a second. Later on, we'll try it. It's a frightful thing to have alive, but it isn't as bad as what Wilbur would have let in if he'd lived longer. You'll never know what the world has escaped. Now we've only this one thing to fight, and it can't multiply. It can, though, do a lot of harm, so we mustn't hesitate to rid the community of it. We must follow it, and the way to begin is to go to the place that has just been wrecked. Let somebody lead the way. I don't know your roads very well, but I've an idea there might be a shorter cut across lots. How about it? The men shuffled about a moment, and then Earl Sawyer spoke softly, pointing with a grimy finger through the steadily lessening rain. I guess you can get to Seth Bishop's quickest by cutting across the lower meadow here, wading the brook at the low place and climbing through Carrier's Mowing and the timber lot beyond. That comes out on the upper road, mighty nigh Seth's, a little t'other side. Armitage, with Rice and Morgan, started to walk in the direction indicated, and most of the natives followed slowly. The sky was growing lighter, and there were signs that the storm had worn itself away. When Armitage inadvertently took a wrong direction, Joe Osborne warned him and walked ahead to show the right one. Courage and confidence were mounting, though the twilight of the almost perpendicular wooded hill which lay towards the end of their shortcut, and among whose fantastic ancient trees they had to scramble as if up a ladder, put these qualities to a severe test. At length they emerged on a muddy road to find the sun coming out. They were a little beyond the Seth Bishop place, but bent trees and hideously unmistakable tracks showed what had passed by. Only a few moments were consumed in surveying the ruins just round the bend. It was the Fry incident all over again, and nothing dead or living was found in either of the collapsed shells, which had been the Bishop house and barn. No one cared to remain there amidst the stench and tarry stickiness, but all turned instinctively to the line of horrible prints leading on towards the wrecked Whately farmhouse and the altar-crowned slopes of Sentinel Hill. As the men passed the site of Wilbur Whately's abode, they shuddered visibly, and seemed again to mix hesitancy with their zeal. It was no joke tracking down something as big as a house that one could not see, but that had all the vicious malevolence of a demon. Opposite the base of Sentinel Hill, the tracks left the road, and there was a fresh bending and matting visible along the broad swath,
Melody
marking
says,
the
this
monstrous
schedule
form
does
of
keep you
to
much
and from the
perkier.
summit.
Yeah, thank you,
Armitage
love.
produced a pocket telescope of
You are
considerable power and
genius.
scanned the steep green side of the hill. Then he handed the instrument to Morgan, whose sight was keener. After a moment of gazing, Morgan cried out sharply, passing the glass to Earl Sawyer and indicating a certain spot on the slope with his finger. Sawyer, as clumsy as most non-users of optical devices are, fumbled a while, but eventually focused the lenses with Armitage's aid. When he did so, his cry was less restrained than Morgan's had been.
God almighty, the grass and bushes is a-moving. It's a-going up, slow like, creepy, up to the top this minute. Heaven only knows what for.
Then the germ of panic seemed to spread among the seekers. It was one thing to chase the nameless entity, but quite another to find it. Spells might be all right, but suppose they weren't? Voices began questioning Armitage about what he knew of the thing, and no reply seemed quite to satisfy. Everyone seemed to feel himself in close proximity to phases of nature and of being utterly forbidden and wholly outside the sane experience of mankind. 10. In the end, the three men from Arkham, old white-bearded Dr. Armitage, stocky, iron-gray Professor Rice, and lean, youngish Dr. Morgan, ascended the mountain alone. After much patient instruction regarding its focusing and use, they left the telescope with the frightened group that remained in the road, and as they climbed they were watched closely by those among whom the glass was passed round. It was hard going, and Armitage had to be helped more than once. High above the toiling group, the great swath trembled as its hellish maker repassed with snail-like deliberateness. Then it was obvious that the pursuers were gaining. Curtis Whately, of the undecayed branch, was holding the telescope when the Arkham party detoured radically from the swath. He told the crowd that the men were evidently trying to get to a subordinate peak, which overlooked the swath at a point considerably ahead of where the shrubbery was now bending. This, indeed, proved to be true, and the party was seen to gain the minor elevation only a short time after the invisible blasphemy had passed it. Then Wesley Corey, who had taken the glass, cried out that Armitage was adjusting the sprayer which Rice held, and that something must be about to happen. The crowd stirred uneasily, recalling that his sprayer was expected to give the unseen horror a moment of visibility. 2 or 3 men shut their eyes, but Curtis Whately snatched back the telescope and strained his vision to the utmost. He saw that Rice, from the party's point of vantage above and behind the entity, had an excellent chance of spreading the potent powder with marvelous effect. Those without the telescope saw only an instant's flash of grey cloud, a cloud about the size of a moderately large building near the top of the mountain. Curtis, who held the instrument, dropped it with a piercing shriek into the ankle-deep mud of the road. He reeled and would have crumpled to the ground had not 2 or 3 others seized and steadied him. All he could do was moan half inaudibly,
Oh, oh, great God, that.
There was a pandemonium of questioning, and only Henry Wheeler thought to rescue the fallen telescope and wipe it clean of mud. Curtis was past all coherence, and even isolated replies were almost too much for him.
Bigger than a barn, all made of squirming ropes. Whole things sort of shaped like a hen's egg, bigger than anything. We've dozens of legs like hogsheads that have shut up when they step. Nothing solid about it. All like jelly and made of separate wriggling ropes, pushed close together. Great bulging eyes all over it. 10 or 20 mouths, or trunks, sticking out all along the sides. Big as stovepipes, and all a tossing and opening and shutting. All grey, with kind of blue or purple rings, and God in heaven, that our face on top.
This final memory, whatever it was, proved too much for poor Curtis, and he collapsed completely before he could say more. Fred Farr and Will Hutchins carried him to the roadside and laid him on the damp grass. Henry Wheeler, trembling, turned the rescued telescope on the mountain to see what he might. Through the lenses were discernible 3 tiny figures, apparently running towards the summit as fast as the steep incline allowed. Only these, nothing more. Then everyone noticed a strangely unseasonable noise in the deep valley behind, and even in the underbrush of Sentinel Hill itself. It was the piping of unnumbered whippoorwills, and in their shrill chorus there seemed to lurk a note of tense and evil expectancy. Earl Sawyer now took the telescope and reported the 3 figures as standing on the topmost ridge, virtually level with the altar stone, but at a considerable distance from it. One figure, he said, seemed to be raising its hands above its head at rhythmic intervals, and as Sawyer mentioned the circumstance, the crowd seemed to hear a faint, half-musical sound from the distance, as if a loud chant were accompanying the gestures. The weird silhouette on that remote peak must have been a spectacle of infinite grotesqueness and impressiveness, but no observer was in a mood for aesthetic appreciation. "I guess he's saying the spell," whispered Wheeler as he snatched back the telescope. The whippoorwills were piping wildly, and in a singularly curious irregular rhythm, quite unlike that of the visible ritual. Suddenly, the sunshine seemed to lessen without the intervention of any discernible cloud. It was a very peculiar phenomenon, and was plainly marked by all. A rumbling sound seemed brewing beneath the hills, mixed strangely with a concordant rumbling which clearly came from the sky. Lightning flashed aloft, and the wondering crowd looked in vain for the portents of storm. The chanting of the men from Arkham now became unmistakable, and Wheeler saw through the glass that they were all raising their arms in the rhythmic incantation. From some farmhouse far away came the frantic barking of dogs. The change in the quality of the daylight increased, and the crowd gazed about the horizon in wonder. A purplish darkness, born of nothing more than a spectral deepening of the sky's blue, pressed down upon the rumbling hills. Then the lightning flashed again, somewhat brighter than before, and the crowd fancied that it had showed a certain mistiness around the altar stone on the distant height. No one, however, had been using the telescope at that instant. The whippoorwills continued their irregular pulsation, and the men of Dunwich braced themselves tensely against some imponderable menace with which the atmosphere seemed surcharged. Without warning came those deep, cracked, raucous vocal sounds which will never leave the memory of the stricken group who heard them. Not from any human throat were they born, for the organs of man can yield no such acoustic perversions. Rather would one have said they came from the pit itself, had not their source been so unmistakably the altar stone on the peak. It is almost erroneous to call them sounds at all, since so much of their ghastly, infra-bass timbre spoke to dim seats of consciousness and terror far subtler than the ear. Yet one must do so, since their form was indisputably, though vaguely, that of half-articulate words. They were loud, loud as the rumblings and the thunder above which they echoed, yet did they come from no visible being. And because imagination might suggest a conjectural source in the world of non-visible beings, the huddled crowd at the mountain's base huddled still closer and winced as if in expectation of a blow. Rang the hideous croaking out of space. The speaking impulse seemed to falter here, as if some frightful psychic struggle were going on. Henry Wheeler strained his eye at the telescope, but saw only the three grotesquely silhouetted human figures on the peak, all moving their arms furiously in strange gestures as their incantation drew near its culmination. From what black wells of acherontic fear or feeling, from what unplumbed gulfs of extra-cosmic consciousness or obscure, long-latent heredity were those half-articulate thunder croakings drawn? Presently, they began to gather renewed force and coherence as they grew in stark, utter, ultimate frenzy.
Help! Help! Father! Father! Look, something!
But that was all. The pallid group in the road, still reeling at the indisputably English syllables that had poured thickly and thunderously down from the frantic vacancy beside that shocking altar stone, were never to hear such syllables again. Instead, they jumped violently at the terrific report which seemed to rend the hills, the deafening cataclysmic peal whose source, bent earth or sky, no hearer was ever
Stretch.
able to place. A single lightning bolt shot from the purple zenith to the altar stone,
You know what?
and a
I'm
great
feeling a little hungry.
thunder
I'm
roll
gonna
with
take a little
blue
snack
force
break.
and indescribable stench swept down from the hill to all the countryside. Trees, grass, and underbrush were whipped into a fury, and the frightened crowd at the mountain's base, weakened by the lethal fetter that seemed about to
Have some more of
asphyxiate them,
this
were almost
supremely
thrown at their
spicy
feet.
hummus,
Dogs
which
howled
isn't
from
very
the distance.
spicy.
Green grass and foliage wilted to a curious, sickly yellow-grey, and over field and forest were scattered the bodies of dead whippoorwills. The stench left quickly, but the vegetation never came right again. To this day there is something queer and unholy about the growths on and around that fearsome hill. Curtis Whately was only just regaining consciousness when the Arkham men came slowly down the mountain in the beams of a sunlight once
Oh
more
shit! I missed
brilliantly
something.
upon
Did they
from the
send
distance.
it back?
Green grass and foliage wilted forth, and just a cataclysmic peal whose source, be it inner earth or sky, no hearer was ever.
Okay.
But that was all. The pallid group in the road, still reeling at the indisputably English syllables that had poured thickly and thunderously down from the frantic vacancy beside that shocking altar stone, were never to hear such syllables again. Instead, they jumped violently at the terrific report which seemed to rend the hills, the deafening cataclysmic peal whose source, be it inner earth or sky,
Strutty McButtbrain. See, I can yell random things too. That you can, love. God, you're so friggin' adorable. I love you.
no hero was ever able to place. A single lightning bolt shot from the purple zenith to the altar stone, and a great tidal wave of viewless force and indescribable stench swept down from the hill to all the countryside. Trees, grass, and underbrush were whipped into a fury, and the frightened crowd at the mountain's base,
55
weakened by the
minutes.
lethal fetter that seemed about to asphyxiate them, were almost hurled off their feet. Dogs howled from the distance. Green grass and foliage wilted to a curious, sickly yellow-grey, and over field and forest were scattered the bodies of dead whippoorwills. The stench left quickly, but the vegetation never came right again. To this day there is something queer and unholy about the growths on and around that fearsome hill. Curtis Whately was only just regaining consciousness when the Arkham men came slowly down the mountain in the beams of a sunlight once more brilliant and untainted. They were grave and quiet, and seemed shaken by memories and reflections even more terrible than those which had reduced the group of natives to a state of cowed quivering. In reply to a jumble of questions, they only shook their heads and reaffirmed one vital fact. The thing is gone forever, Armitage said. It has been split up into what it was originally made of, and can never exist again. It was an impossibility in a normal world. Only the least fraction was really matter in any sense we know. It was like its father, and most of it has gone back to him in some vague realm or dimension outside our material universe, some vague abyss out of which only the most accursed rites of human blasphemy could ever have called him for a moment on the hills. There was a brief silence, and in that pause the scattered senses of poor Curtis Whately began to knit back into a sort of continuity, so that he put his hands to his head with a moan. Memory seemed to pick itself up where it had left off, and the horror of the sight that had prostrated him burst in upon him again.
Oh my God! That face! That face on top of it! That face with the red eyes and crinkly albino hair, and no chin like the Whaleys. It was an octopus, centipede, spider kind of thing. But there was a half-shaped man's face on top of it, and it looked like Wizard Whately's. Only it was yards and yards across.
He paused, exhausted, as the whole group of natives stared in a bewilderment not quite crystallized into fresh terror. Only old Zebulon Whately, who wonderingly
Holy shit.
remembered ancient things.
So it's like that old wizard that disappeared, like friggin' turned himself into a friggin' otherworldly beast. That sort of sounds like what's going on here.
Octopus, centipede, spider kind of thing. But there was a half-shaped man's face on top of it, and it looked like Wizard Whately's. Only it was yards and yards across.
He paused, exhausted, as the whole group of natives stared in a bewilderment not quite crystallized into fresh terror. Only old Zebulon Whately, who wonderingly remembered
Yeah, I miss
ancient
Cthulhu
things,
too.
but
I
who
think
could be
those ones
silent
were like
heretofore,
written.
spoke aloud.
Something about it has like a
He
different
rambled.
flavor of writing.
I heard old Whately say as how someday we'd hear a child allowing us to call him his father's name on the top of Sentinel Hill.
But Joe Osborne interrupted him to question the Arkham men anew.
What was it, anyhow? And however did young Wizard Whately call it out of the air it come from?
Armitage chose his words very carefully. It was, well, it was mostly a kind of force that doesn't belong in our part of space. a kind of force that acts and grows and shapes itself by other laws than those of our sort of nature. We have no business calling in such things from outside, and only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever tried it. There was some of it in Wilbur Whately himself, enough to make a devil and a precocious monster of him, and to make his passing out a pretty terrible sight. I'm going to burn his accursed diary, and if you men are wise, you'll dynamite that altar stone up there, and pull down all the rings of standing stones on the other hills. Things like that brought down the beings those Whateleys were so fond of, the beings they were going to let in tangibly to wipe out the human race and drag the earth off to some nameless place for some nameless purpose. But as to this thing we've just sent back, the Whateleys raised it for a terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big from the same reason that Wilbur grew fast and big, but it beat him because it had a greater share of the outsideness in it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out of the air. He didn't call it out. It was his twin brother, but it looked more like the father than he did.
Oh.
The Whisperer in Darkness. 1.
Let's see when we get back to Cthulhu.
Bear in mind closely that I did not see any actual visual horror at the end. To say that a mental shock was the cause of what I inferred, that last straw which sent me racing out of the lonely Akeley farmhouse and through the wild domed hills of Vermont.
Damn. It looks like we're done with Cthulhu for a while, unless any of these stories involve him. Because it's The Whisper in Darkness, followed by The Dreams in the Witch House, and then At the Mountains of Madness, then The Shadow over Innsmouth, followed by The Shadow Out of Time. After that is The Hunter of the Dark. Then it's The Thing on the Doorstep. And then it's The History of the Necronomicon. And lastly, The Fungi from Yogoth. And to top that all off, it's the outro. Lovecraft, Into the Abyss by Ian Gordon.
In a commandeered motor at night is to ignore the plainest facts of my final experience.
Yes, we want some cosmic deity kaiju like
the information and
kaiju
speculations
action.
of Henry Akeley, the things I saw and heard, and the admitted vividness of the impression produced on me by these things. I cannot prove even now whether I was right or wrong in my hideous inference. For after all, Akeley's disappearance establishes nothing. People found nothing amiss in his house, despite the bullet marks on the outside and inside. It was just as though he had walked out casually for a ramble in the hills and failed to return. There was not even a sign that a guest had been there, or that those horrible cylinders and machines had been stored in the study. That he had mortally feared the crowded green hills and endless trickle of brooks among which he had been born and reared means nothing at all either. The thousands are subject to just such morbid fears. Eccentricity, moreover, could easily account for his strange acts and apprehensions toward the last. The whole matter began, so far as I am concerned, with the historic and unprecedented Vermont floods of November 3rd, 1927. I was then, as now, an instructor of literature at Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts, and an enthusiastic amateur student of New England folklore. Shortly after the flood, amidst the varied reports of hardship, suffering, and organized relief which filled the press, there appeared certain odd stories of things found floating in some of the swollen rivers, so that many of my friends embarked on curious discussions and appealed to me to shed what light I could on the subject. I felt flattered at having my folklore study taken so seriously, and did what I could to belittle the wild, vague tales which seemed so clearly an outgrowth of old rustic superstitions. It amused me to find several persons of education who insisted that some stratum of obscure, distorted fact might underlie the rumors. The tales thus brought to my notice came mostly through newspaper cuttings, though one yarn had an oral source and was repeated to a friend of mine in a letter from his mother in Hardwick, Vermont. The type of thing described was essentially the same in all cases, though there seemed to be three separate instances involved, one connected with the Winooski River near Montpelier, another attached to the West River in Windham County beyond New Fane, and a third centering in the Passumpsic in Caledonia County above Lyndonville. Of course, many of the stray items mentioned other instances, but on analysis they all seem to boil down to these three. In each case, country folk reported seeing one or more very bizarre and disturbing objects in the surging waters that poured down from the unfrequented hills, and there was a widespread tendency to connect these sites with a primitive, half-forgotten cycle of whispered legend which old people resurrected for the occasion. What people thought they saw were organic shapes, not quite like any they had ever seen before. Naturally, there were many human bodies washed along by the streams in that tragic period, but those who described these strange shapes felt quite sure that they were not human, despite some superficial resemblances in size and general outline. Nor
Hold on. Melody says, I had a fun discussion ages ago. Cthulhu versus Godzilla. No contest. Cthulhu would curb stomp Godzilla. Definitely. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, Cthulhu is like an ancient one, like existing before time was time, and our existence now is just like he's pretty much just taking a nap at the moment. And I have no idea how titanic Cthulhu is, but like Godzilla, he's just like I guess there's like different schools of thought in that now. Like it said that he came from radiation, like he was like a mutation of nuclear, like man like messing with nuclear powers and it like seeping into the water and it like mutated a creature and became Godzilla. And then like the more recent like thought like with the recent movies is that Godzilla is like well, he's not an ancient one. I don't. I wouldn't imagine, but like just a creature like dwelling in the depths, who was awoken by humans messing with nuclear power. Billy says Cthulhu can only be hurt by omnipotent powers. Yeah, totally. Iso's here. What's up, Iso? We're just talking about Cthulhu and listening to Lovecraft.
said the witnesses, could they have been any kind of animal known to Vermont? They were pinkish things about 5 feet long, with crustaceous bodies bearing vast pairs of dorsal fins or membranous wings, and several sets of articulated limbs, and with a sort of convoluted ellipsoid covered with multitudes of very short antennae where a head would ordinarily be. It was really remarkable how closely the reports from different sources tended to coincide, though the wonder was lessened by the fact that the old legends, shared at one time throughout the hill country, furnished a morbidly vivid picture which might well have colored the imaginations of all the witnesses concerned. It was my conclusion that such witnesses, in every case naive and simple backwoods folk, had glimpsed the battered and bloated bodies of human beings or farm animals in the whirling currents, and had allowed the half-remembered folklore to invest these pitiful objects with
Yeah, we've already discussed Lovecraft's racism, but we just really love his writing. Like he has this certain type of writing that just I don't know is like is like fucking awesome. Just the classical way in which he writes and the period in which he wrote it in, it's like it's old enough to like feel classic, but then like still new enough to feel somewhat contemporary. And his style of horror, just like the cosmic horror, is just something I'm just so into. I love it. It's like the cosmic horror that he writes is just like writing how humans are just so insignificant to compared to these like ancient horrors that can just peek in from other realms or realities and destroy human lives, not because they're malicious. It's just sort of like their nature to do so. So like think of like the life of an ant, just like going about his business, doing this and that, and like a human to them could be like considered like maybe some sort of like cosmic being, at least on that scope. And then gets that ant gets like stepped on by like a human, and it's just like seems so cruel or whatever. But then like that human didn't really realize that that ant was underfoot, and it's like he just gets killed, not out of any sort of maliciousness. It's just like, oh, just didn't see it there. But then it's just an ant, compared to that human. But to that ant's life is like it's just like a life ending. But then on the other hand, like if you have like a person studying ants or like fond of ants, and then it sees like ants in trouble, like maybe in a puddle or something, just struggling to get out. That human like bends down, reaches down, and like scoops that ant out of like a puddle of water, and then like saves it. So like this ant in its reality, in its comprehension, was saved by this like titanic being out of like all gracious. But then the next day, that ant could be like crushed by like another human being. So it's it kind of like delves into that sort of like sense where compared to these titanic ancient ones, the old ones, we are nothing but ants, and they could wipe us all out in an instant. But it's just like more or less like in their nature to do so, not with like the sense of like any maliciousness, because like compared to them there's like no malicious act in it, because these are just like tiny insignificant lives compared to them. It's it's pretty cool. It just kind of like makes you feel like just so useless, like especially if you put your mind in the seat of the protagonist, where they're trying to do all they can to like either save people or survive, and compared to this like cosmic force, it's like their efforts are just so puny and futile. Anyway, yeah. That's why I love cosmic horror.
Fantastic attributes. The ancient folklore, while cloudy, evasive, and largely forgotten by
And I like how Lovecraft gets into like the, I guess, the theology of it, like all of his characters, like some of them are like trying to delve deeper into the belief structure of the cults that surround some of these ancient ones, and all the mysticism and the spells, and just like trying to figure it out and wrap their minds around it. It's just pretty darn cool, I guess. At least
the
in my
present
head.
generation, was of a highly singular character, and obviously reflected the influence of still earlier Indian tales.
What do you think, Melody?
I knew it well, though I had never been in Vermont, through the exceedingly rare monograph of Eli Davenport, which embraces material orally obtained prior to 1839 among the oldest people of the state. This material, moreover, closely coincided with tales which I had personally heard from elderly rustics in the mountains of New Hampshire. Briefly summarized, it hinted at a hidden race of monstrous beings which lurked somewhere among the remoter hills, in the deep woods of the highest peaks, and the dark valleys where streams trickle from them.
Melody says, I think that I'm awesome. Hells yeah, you are.
Unknown sources, these beings were seldom glimpsed, but evidences of their presence were reported by those who had ventured farther than usual up the slopes of certain mountains or into certain deep, steep-sided gorges that even the wolves shunned. There were queer footprints or claw prints in the mud of brook margins and barren patches, and curious circles of stones with the grass around them worn away, which did not seem to have been placed or entirely shaped by nature. There were, too, certain caves of problematical depth in the sides of the hills, with mouths closed by boulders in a manner scarcely accidental, and with more than an average quota of the queer prints leading both toward and away from them, if indeed the direction of these prints could be justly estimated. And worst of all, there were the things which adventurous people had seen very rarely in the twilight of the remotest valleys and the dense perpendicular woods above the limits of normal hill climbing. It would have been less uncomfortable if the stray accounts of these things had not agreed so well. As it was, nearly all the rumors had several points in common, averring that the creatures were a sort of huge, light red crab, with many pairs of legs and with two great bat-like wings in the middle of the back. They sometimes walked on all their legs and sometimes on the hindmost pair only, using the others to convey large objects of indeterminate nature. On one occasion, they were spied in considerable numbers, a detachment of them wading along a shallow woodland watercourse, 3 abreast in evidently disciplined formation. Once a specimen was seen flying, launching itself from the top of a bold, lonely hill at night, and vanishing in the sky after its great flapping wings had been silhouetted an instant against the full moon. These things seemed content, on the whole, to let mankind alone, though they were at times held responsible for the disappearance of venturesome individuals, especially persons who built houses too close to certain valleys or too high up on certain mountains. Many localities came to be known as inadvisable to settle in, the feeling persisting long after the cause was forgotten. People would look up some of the neighboring mountain precipices with a shudder, even when not recalling how many settlers had been lost, and how many farmhouses burnt to ashes on the lower slopes of those grim, green sentinels. But while, according to the earliest legends, the creatures would appear to have harmed only those trespassing on their privacy, there were later accounts of their curiosity respecting men, and of their attempts to establish secret outposts in the human world. There were tales of the queer claw prints seen around farmhouse windows in the morning, and of occasional disappearances in regions outside the obviously haunted areas. Tales, besides, of buzzing voices in imitation of human speech, which made surprising offers to lone travelers on roads and cart paths in the deep woods, and of children frightened out of their wits by things seen or heard, where the primal forest pressed close upon their dooryards. In the final layer of legends, the layer just preceding the decline of superstition and the abandonment of close contact with the dreaded places, there are shocked references to hermits and remote farmers who at some period of life appeared to have undergone a repellent mental change, and who were shunned and whispered about as mortals who had sold themselves to the strange beings. In one of the northeastern counties, it seemed to be a fashion about 1800 to accuse eccentric and unpopular recluses of being allies or representatives of the abhorred things. As to what the things were, explanations naturally varied. The common name applied to them was those ones, or the old ones, though other terms had a local and transient use. Perhaps the bulk of the Puritan settlers set them down bluntly as familiars of the devil, and made them a basis of all theological speculation. Those with Celtic legendary in their heritage, mainly the Scotch-Irish element of New Hampshire, and their kindred who had settled in Vermont on Governor Wentworth's colonial grants, linked them vaguely with the malign fairies and little people of the bogs and rothes, and protected themselves with scraps of incantation handed down through many generations. But the Indians had the most fantastic theories of all. While different tribal legends differed, there was a marked consensus of belief in certain vital particulars, it being unanimously agreed that the creatures were not native to this earth. The Pennacook myths, which were the most consistent and picturesque, thought that the winged ones came from the great bear in the sky, and had mines in our earthly hills, whence they took a kind of stone they could not get on any other world. They did not live here, said the myths, but merely maintained outposts and flew back with vast cargoes of stone to their own stars in the north. They harmed only those earth people who got too near them or spied upon them. Animals shunned them through instinctive hatred, not because of being hunted. They could not eat the things and animals of earth, but brought their own food from the stars. It was bad to get near them, and sometimes young hunters who went into their hills never came back. It was not good either to listen to what they whispered at night in the forest with voices like a bee's that tried to be like the voices of men. They knew the speech of all kinds of men, Pennacots, Hurons, men of the Five Nations, but did not seem to have or need any speech of their own. They talked with their heads, which changed color in different ways to mean different things. All the legendary, of course, white and Indian alike, died down during the 19th century, except for occasional atavistical flare ups. The ways of the Vermonters became settled, and once their habitual paths and dwellings were established according to a certain fixed plan, they remembered less and less what fears and avoidances had determined that plan, and even that there had been any fears or avoidances. Most people simply knew that certain hilly regions were considered as highly unhealthy, unprofitable, and generally unlucky to live in, and that the farther one kept from them, the better off one usually was. In time, the ruts of custom and economic interest became so deeply cut in approved places that there was no longer any reason for going outside them, and the haunted hills were left deserted by accident rather than by design. Save during infrequent local scares, only wonder-loving grandmothers and retrospective nonagenarians ever whispered of beings dwelling in those hills, and even such whispers admitted that there was not much to fear from those things now that they were used to the presence of houses and settlements, and now that human beings let their chosen territory severely alone. All this I had known from my reading, and from certain folk tales picked up in New Hampshire. Hence, when the flood time rumors began to appear, I could easily guess what imaginative background had evolved them. I took great pains to explain this to my friends, and was correspondingly amused when several contentious souls continued to insist on a possible element of truth in the reports. Such persons tried to point out that the early legends had a significant persistence and uniformity, and that the virtually unexplored nature of the Vermont hills made it unwise to be dogmatic about what might or might not dwell among them, nor could they be silenced by my assurance that all the myths were of a well-known pattern
Yeah,
common to
30
most of
minutes.
mankind, and determined by early phases of imaginative experience, which always produced the same type of delusion. It was of no use to demonstrate to such opponents that the Vermont myths differed but little in essence from those universal legends of natural personification which filled the ancient world with fauns and dryads and satyrs, suggested the Kalakanzari of modern Greece, and gave to wild Wales and Ireland their dark hints of strange, small, and terrible hidden races of troglodytes and burrowers. No use either to point out the even more
30
startling
minutes left.
similar belief of the Nepalese hill tribes in the dreaded Migo, or abominable snowmen, who lurk
Oh,
hideously amidst the ice
shit!
or rock pinnacles of the Himalayan summits. When I brought up this evidence, my opponents turned it against me by claiming that it must imply some actual historicity for the ancient
Coffee,
tales,
coffee,
that it
coffee,
must
coffee,
argue the
coffee,
real
coffee,
existence of
coffee.
some queer elder earth race, driven to hiding after the advent and dominance of mankind, which might very conceivably have survived in reduced numbers to relatively recent times, or even to the present. The more I laughed at such theories, the more these stubborn friends asseverated them, adding that even without the heritage of legend, the recent reports were too clear, consistent, detailed, and sanely prosaic in manner of telling to be completely ignored. Two or three fanatical extremists went so far as to hint at possible meanings in the ancient Indian tales which gave the hidden beings a non terrestrial origin, citing the extravagant books of Charles Fort, with their claims that voyagers from other worlds and outer space have often visited Earth. Most of my foes, however, were merely romanticists who insisted on trying to transfer to real life the fantastic lore of lurking little people made popular by the magnificent horror fiction of Arthur Machen. 2. As was only natural under the circumstances, this piquant debating finally got into print in the form of letters to the Arkham Advertiser, some of which were copied in the press of those Vermont regions whence the flood stories came. The Rutland Herald gave half a page of extracts from the letters on both sides, while the Brattleboro Reformer reprinted one of my long historical
Yes,
and
Eso's
mythological
asking, was it a
summaries
break
in
after
full,
that and then
with some
comms?
accompanying comments
Yep.
in the Pendrifter's thoughtful column, which supported and applauded my
Melody
skeptical
also says
conclusions. By the spring of 1928, I was almost a well-known figure in Vermont, notwithstanding the fact that I had never set foot in the state. Then came the challenging letters from Henry Akeley, which impressed me so profoundly, and which took me for the first and last time to that fascinating realm of crowded green precipices and muttering forest streams. Most of what I now know of Henry Wentworth Akeley was gathered by correspondence with his neighbors and with his only son in California, after my experience in his lonely farmhouse. He was, I discovered, the last representative on his home soil of a long, locally distinguished line of jurists, administrators, and gentlemen agriculturists. In him, however, the family mentally had veered away from practical affairs to pure scholarship, so that he had been a notable student of mathematics, astronomy, biology, anthropology, and folklore at the University of Vermont. I had never previously heard of him, and he did not give many autobiographical details in his communications, but from the first I saw he was a man of character, education, and intelligence, albeit a recluse with very little worldly sophistication. Despite the incredible
Now
nature
saying,
of
hey,
what he
Fufu,
claimed,
show what Eso
I
what you
could not
worked on
help at
yesterday.
once taking Akeley more seriously than I had taken any of the
I'll
other
show him
challenges
after
of
the
my
stream.
years. For one thing, he was really close to the actual phenomena, visible and tangible, that he speculated so grotesquely about. And for another thing, he was amazingly willing to leave his conclusions in a tentative state, like a true man of science. He had no personal preferences to advance, and was always guided by what he took to be solid evidence. Of course, I began by considering him mistaken, but gave him credit for being intelligently
He shall
mistaken.
be soon
And
enough,
at no
love.
time did I emulate some of his friends in attributing his ideas and his fear of the lonely green hills to insanity. I could see that there was a great deal to the man, and knew that what he reported must surely come from strange circumstances deserving investigation, however little it might have to do with the fantastic causes he assigned. Later on, I received from him certain material proofs, which placed the matter on a somewhat different and bewilderingly bizarre basis. I cannot do better than transcribe in full, so far as is possible, the long letter in which Akeley introduced himself, and which formed such an important landmark
This
in
is
my own
fine.
intellectual history. It is no longer in my possession, but my memory holds almost every word of its portentous message.
Love you,
And again,
Silver Snacks.
I affirm my confidence in the sanity of the man who wrote it. Here is the text, a text which reached me in the cramped, archaic-looking scrawl of one who had obviously not mingled much with the world during his sedate, scholarly life. RFD2, Townsend, Windham County, Vermont, May 5th, 1928. Albert N. Wilmot, Esquire, 118 Saltonstall Street, Arkham, Massachusetts. My dear sir, I have read with great interest the Brattleboro Reformer's reprint,
Donation
April
dude?
23rd, 28, of your letter on the
Oh,
recent stories of
let's check
strange
this
bodies
out.
seen floating in our flooded streams last fall,
Oh,
and on the curious
I had.
folklore
Oh,
they
that
so
guy
well agree
got
with.
back to me.
It is easy to see why an outlander would take the position you take, and even my pendrifter agrees with you. That is the attitude generally taken by educated persons both in and out of Vermont, and was my own attitude as a young man. I am now 57. Before my studies, both general and in Davenport's book, led me to do some exploring in parts of the hills hereabouts not usually visited. I was directed towards such studies by the
Where
queer
is
old tales
my?
I used
There
to
it
hear
is.
from
There's my
elderly
coffee.
farmers of the more ignorant sort, but now I wish I'd let the whole matter alone. I might say, with all proper modesty, that the subject of anthropology and folklore is by no
Burp.
means strange to me. I took a good deal of it at college, and am familiar with most of the standard authorities, such as Tyler, Lubbock, Fraser, Quatrefages, Murray, Osborne, Keith, Boole, G. Elliott Smith, and so on. It is no news to me that tales of hidden races are as old as all mankind. I have seen the reprints of letters from you, and those arguing with you, in the Rutland Herald, and guess I know about where your controversy stands at the present time. What I desire to say now is that I'm
Oh.
afraid your adversaries are nearer right than
This was
yourself.
Iso.
Even though all reason seems to be on your side, they are nearer right than they realize
Thank you, Iso.
themselves.
Iso
For of course
McIntosh
they
is
go only
donating.
by theory and cannot know what I know. If I knew as little of the matter as they, I would not feel justified in believing as they do. I would be wholly on your side. You can see that I'm having a hard time getting to the point,
Iso says doop
probably
doop.
because I really dread getting to the point. The
Awesome.
upshot of the
You're
matter
awesome,
is that
Iso.
I have certain evidence that monstrous things do indeed live in the woods on the high hills,
Are you
which
seeing that
nobody
means
visits.
you want
I
a
have not seen any of the things
donation
floating in the
doodle?
rivers, as reported, but I have seen things like them, under circumstances I dread to repeat. I have seen footprints, and of late have seen them nearer my own home. I live in the old Akeley place south of Townsend Village,
Just
on the
taking
side of
note of
Black
it,
Mountain,
just
than I
so I
dare
don't
tell you
forget.
now. And I have overheard voices in the woods at certain points that I will not even begin to describe on paper. At one place, I heard them so much that I took a phonograph there, with a dictaphone attachment and wax blank, and I shall try to arrange to have you hear the record I got. I have run it on the machine for some of the old people up here, and one of the voices had nearly scared them paralyzed by reason of its likeness to a certain voice, that buzzing voice in the woods which Davenport mentions, that their grandmothers have told about and mimicked for them. I know what most people think of a man who tells about hearing voices, but before you draw conclusions, just listen to this record and ask some of the older backwoods people what they think of it. If you can account for it normally, very well, but there must be something behind it. Ex nihilo nihil fit, you know. Now, my object in writing you is not to start an argument, but to give you information which I think a man of your tastes will find deeply interesting. This is private. Publicly, I am on your side, for certain things shew me that it does not do for people to know too much about these matters. My own studies are now wholly private, and I would not think of saying anything to attract people's attention and cause them to visit the places I have explored. It is true, terribly true, that there are non-human creatures watching us all the time, with spies among us gathering information.
I got
This
some
is from a
negative
wretched
space here,
man
but
who, if he was
does
sane,
that really
as
matter?
I think he was one of
I
those
think I got
spies.
everything I need.
I got a large part of my clues to the matter.
Save.
He later killed himself, but I have reason to think there are others now. The things come from another planet, being able to live in interstellar space and fly through it on
Looks like we got
clumsy,
enough
powerful
time to
wings
start
which have a way of
inking on this
resisting
one.
the ether, but which are too poor at steering to be of much use in helping them about on Earth. I will tell you about this later, if you do not dismiss me at once as a man.
Hold on. Did
They
I
come here to
get
get
the right
metals
one?
from mines
No, I
that go
didn't.
deep
Alright, there
under
we
the
go.
hills, and I think I know where they come from. They will not hurt us if we let them alone, but no one can say what will happen if we get too curious about them. Of course, a good army of men could wipe out their mining colony. That is what they are afraid of. But if that happened, more would come from outside, any number of them. They could easily conquer the earth, but have not tried so far, because they have not needed to. They would rather leave things as they are, to save bother. I think they mean to get rid of me, because of what I've discovered. There is a great black stone with unknown hieroglyphics half worn away, which I found in the woods on Round Hill, east of here. And after I took it home, everything became different. If they think I suspect too much, they will either kill me or take me off the earth to where they come from. They like to take away men of learning once in a while, to keep informed on the state of things in the human world. This leads me to my secondary purpose in addressing you, namely, to urge you to hush up the present debate rather than give it more publicity. People must be kept away from these hills, and in order to effect this, their curiosity ought not to be aroused any further. Heaven knows there is peril enough anyway, with promoters and real estate men flooding Vermont with herds of summer people to overrun the wild places and cover the hills with cheap bungalows. I shall welcome further communication with you, and she'll try to send you that phonograph record. And Blackstone, which is so warm that photographs don't shew much, by express if you are willing. I say try, because I think those creatures have a way of tampering with things around here. There is a sullen, furtive fellow named Brown, on a farm near the village, who I think is their spy. Little by little, they are trying to cut me off from our world, because I know too much about their world. They have the most amazing way of finding out what I do. You may not even get this letter. I think I shall have to leave this part of the country and go to live with my son in San Diego, California, if things get any worse. But it is not easy to give up the place you were born in, where your family has lived for 6 generations. Also, I would hardly dare sell this house to anybody now that the creatures have taken notice of it. They seem to be trying to get the Blackstone back and destroy the phonograph record, but I shall not let them if I can help it. My great police dogs always hold them back, for there are very few here as yet. They are clumsy in getting about. As I have said, their wings are not much use for short flights on Earth. I am on the very brink of deciphering that stone in a very terrible way, and with your knowledge of folklore, you may be able to supply missing links enough to help me. I suppose you know all about the fearful myths antedating the coming of man to the Earth, the Yog-Sothoth and Cthulhu cycles, which are hinted at in the Necronomicon. I had access to a copy of that once, and hear that you have one in your college library under lock and key. To conclude, Mr. Wilmarth, I think that with our respective studies, we can be very useful to each other. I don't wish to put you in any peril, and suppose I ought to warn you that possession of the stone and the record won't be very safe, but I think you will find any risks worth running for the sake of knowledge. I will drive down to Newfane or Brattleboro to send whatever you authorize me to send, for the express offices there are more to be trusted. I might say that I live quite alone now, since I can't keep hired help anymore. They won't stay because of the things that try to get near the house at night, and that keep the dogs barking continually. I am glad I didn't get as deep as this into the business while my wife was alive, for it would have driven her mad. Hoping that I am not bothering you unduly, and that you will decide to get in touch with me, rather than throw this letter into the wastebasket as a madman's raving, I am yours, very truly, Henry W. Akeley. P.S. I am making some extra prints of certain photographs taken by me, which I think will help to prove a number of the points I've touched on. The old people think they are monstrously true. I shall send you these very soon, if you're interested. H.W.A. It would be difficult to describe my sentiments upon reading this strange document for the first time. By all ordinary rules, I ought to have laughed more loudly at these extravagances than at the far milder theories which had previously moved me to mirth. Yet something in the tone of the letter made me take it with paradoxical seriousness. Not that I believed for a moment in the hidden race from the stars which my correspondent spoke of, but that, after some grave preliminary doubts, I grew to feel oddly sure of his sanity and sincerity, and of his confrontation by some genuine, though singular and abnormal phenomenon, which he could not explain except in this imaginative way. It could not be as he thought it, I reflected, yet on the other hand it could not be otherwise than worthy of investigation. The man seemed unduly excited and alarmed about something, but it was hard to think that all cause was lacking. He was so specific and logical in certain ways, and after all, his yarn did fit in so perplexingly well with some of the old myths, even the wildest Indian legends. That he had really overheard disturbing voices in the hills, and had really found the black stone he spoke about, was wholly possible, despite the crazy inferences he had made. Inferences probably suggested by the man who had claimed to be a spy of the outer beings, and had later killed himself. It was easy to deduce that this man must have been wholly insane, but that he probably had a streak of perverse outward logic, which made the naive Akeley, already prepared for such things by his folklore studies, believe his tale. As for the latest developments, it appeared from his inability to keep hired help that Akeley's humbler rustic neighbors were as convinced as he that his house was besieged by uncanny things at night. The dogs really barked, too. And then the matter of that phonograph record, which I could not but believe he had obtained in the way he said. It must mean something, whether animal noises deceptively like human speech, or the speech of some hidden, night-haunting human being, decayed to a state not much above that of lower animals. From this my thoughts went back to the black hieroglyphed stone. and to speculations upon what it might mean. Then, too, what of the
Oh.
photographs which Akeley said he was about to send,
Melody's
and
saying
which the
nice
old
one,
people
dude,
had found
to
so
my
convincingly
burp
terrible?
earlier.
As I reread the cramped handwriting, I felt as never before that my credulous
Thank you, love.
opponents might have more on their side than I had conceded. After all, there might be some queer and perhaps hereditary misshapen outcasts in those shunned hills, even though no such race of starborn monsters, as folklore claimed. And if there were, then the presence of strange bodies in the flooded streams would not be wholly beyond belief. Was it too presumptuous to suppose that both the old legends and the recent reports had this much of reality behind them? But even as I harbored these doubts, I felt ashamed that so fantastic a piece of bizarrerie as Henry Akeley's wild letter had brought them up. In the end, I answered Akeley's letter, adopting a tone of friendly interest and soliciting further particulars. His reply came almost by return mail, and contained, true to promise, a number of Kodak views of scenes and objects illustrating what he had to tell. Glancing at these pictures, as I took them from the envelope, I felt a curious sense of fright and nearness to forbidden things, for in spite of the vagueness of most of them, they had a damnably suggestive power, which was intensified by the fact of their being genuine photographs, actual optical links with what they portrayed, and the product of an impersonal transmitting process without prejudice, fallibility, or mendacity. The more I looked at them, the more I saw that my serious estimate of Akeley and his story had not been unjustified. Certainly these pictures carried conclusive evidence of something in the Vermont hills, which was at least vastly outside the radius of our common knowledge and belief. The worst thing of all was the footprint, a view taken where the sun shone on a mud patch,
Ah,
somewhere in a
nuts. I've
deserted
been
upland.
inking in like
This
a
was no
gray
cheaply
tone.
counterfeited thing. I could see at a glance, for the sharply defined pebbles and grass blades in the field of vision gave a clear index of scale and left no possibility of a tricky double exposure. I've called the thing a footprint, but claw print would be a better term. Even now, I can
Is
scarcely
there...
describe it,
Okay, yeah.
save
I
to
can
say that
preserve
it was
transparency.
hideously crab-like, and that there seemed to be some ambiguity about its direction. It was not a very deep or fresh print, but seemed to be about the size of an average man's foot. From a central pad, pairs of saw-toothed nippers projected in opposite directions,
There we
quite
go.
baffling as to function, if
There we
indeed the whole object
go.
were exclusively an organ of locomotion. Another photograph, evidently a time exposure taken in deep shadow, was of the mouth of a woodland cave, with a boulder of rounded regularity choking the aperture. On the bare ground in front of it, one could just discern a dense network of curious tracks, and when I studied the picture with a magnifier, I felt uneasily sure that the tracks were like the one in the other view. A third picture shewed a druid-like circle of standing stones on the summit of a wild hill. Around the cryptic circle, the grass was very much beaten down and worn away, though I could not detect any footprints even with the glass. The extreme remoteness of the place was apparent from the veritable sea of tenantless mountains which formed the background and stretched away toward a misty horizon. But if the most disturbing of all the views was that of the footprint, the most curiously suggestive was that of the great black stone found in the Round Hill woods. Akeley had photographed it on what was evidently his study table, for I could see rows of books and a bust of Milton in the background. The thing, as nearly as one might guess, had faced the camera vertically with a somewhat irregularly curved surface of 1 by
8
2 feet.
minutes left.
But to say anything definite about that surface, or about the general shape of the whole mass, almost defies the power of language. What outlandish geometrical principles had guided its cutting, for artificially cut it surely was, I could not even begin to guess, and never before had I seen anything which struck me as so strangely and unmistakably alien to this world. Of the hieroglyphics on the surface, I could discern very few, but one or two that I did see gave me rather a shock. Of course, they might be fraudulent, for others besides myself had read the monstrous and abhorred Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, but it nevertheless made me shiver to recognize certain ideographs, which study had taught me to link with the most blood-curdling and blasphemous whispers of things that had a kind of mad half-existence, before the Earth and the other inner worlds of the solar system were made. Of the 5 remaining pictures, 3 were of swamp and hill scenes which seemed to bear traces of hidden and unwholesome tenancy. Another was of a queer mark in the ground, very near Akeley's house, which he said he had photographed the morning after a night on which the dogs had barked more violently than usual. It was very blurred, and one could really draw no certain conclusions from it, but it did seem fiendishly like that other mark or claw print photographed on the deserted upland. The final picture was of the Akeley place itself, a trim white house of 2 stories and attic, about a century and a quarter old, and with a well-kept lawn and stone-bordered path leading up to a tastefully carved Georgian doorway. There were several huge police dogs on the lawn, squatting near a pleasant-faced man with a close-cropped grey beard, whom I took to be Akeley himself, his own photographer, one might infer from the tube-connected bulb in his right hand. From the pictures, I turned to the bulky, closely written letter itself, and for the next 3 hours was immersed in a gulf of unutterable horror. Where Akeley had given only outlines before, he now entered into minute details, presenting long transcripts of words overheard in the woods at night, long accounts of monstrous pinkish forms spied in thickets at twilight on the hills, and a terrible cosmic narrative derived from the application of profound and varied scholarship to the endless bygone discourses of the mad self-styled spy who had killed himself. I found myself faced by names and terms that I had heard elsewhere in the most hideous of connections: Yuggoth, Great Cthulhu, Sathagua, Yog-Sothoth, Rilye, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth, Hastur, Yin, Lang, the Lake of Harley, Beth Mura, the Yellow Sign, Lemur Cathulos, Bran, and the Magnum Innominandum, and was drawn back through nameless eons and inconceivable dimensions to worlds of elder, outer entity, at which the crazed author of the Necronomicon had only guessed in the vaguest way. I was told of the pits of primal life, and of the streams that had trickled down therefrom, and finally of the tiny rivulet from one of those streams, which had become entangled with the destinies of our own earth. My brain whirled, and where before I had attempted to explain things away, I now began to believe in the most abnormal and incredible wonders. The array of vital evidence was damnably vast and overwhelming, and the cool, scientific attitude of Akeley, an attitude removed as far as imaginable from the demented, the fanatical, the hysterical, or even the extravagantly speculative, had a tremendous effect on my thought and judgment. By the time I laid the frightful letter aside, I could understand the fears he had come to entertain, and was ready to do anything in my power to keep people away from those wild, haunted hills. Even now, when time has dulled the impression and made me half question my own experience and horrible doubts, there are things in that letter of Akeley's which I would not quote, or even form into words on paper. I am almost glad that the letter and record and photographs are gone now, and I wish, for reasons I shall soon make clear, that the new planet beyond Neptune had not been discovered. With the reading of that letter, my public debating about the Vermont horror permanently ended. Arguments from opponents remained unanswered or put off with promises, and eventually the controversy petered out into oblivion. During late May and June, I was in constant correspondence with Akeley, though once in a while a letter would be lost, so that we would have to retrace our ground and perform considerable laborious copying. What we were trying to do, as a whole, was to compare notes in matters of obscure mythological scholarship, and arrive at a clearer correlation of the Vermont horrors with the general body of primitive world legend. For one thing, we virtually decided that these morbidities and the hellish Himalayan Migo were one and the same order of incarnated nightmare. There were also absorbing zoological conjectures, which I would have referred to Professor Dexter in my own college, but for Akeley's imperative command to tell no one of the matter before us. If I seem to disobey that command now, it is only because I think that at this stage, a warning about those farther Vermont hills and about those Himalayan peaks which bold explorers are more and more determined to ascend is more conducive to public safety than silence would be. One specific thing we were leading up to was a deciphering of the hieroglyphics on that infamous black stone, a deciphering which might well place us in possession of secrets deeper and more dizzying than any formerly known to man. 3. Toward the end of June, the phonograph record came, shipped from Brattleboro, since Akeley was unwilling to trust conditions on the branch line north of there.
3.
He had begun to feel an increased sense of espionage, aggravated by the loss of some of our letters, and said much about the insidious deeds of certain men, whom he considered tools and agents of the hidden beings. Most of all, he suspected the surly farmer, Walter Brown, who lived alone on a run-down hillside place near the deep woods, and who was often seen loafing around corners in Brattleboro, Bellows Falls, New Fane, and South Londonderry in the most inexplicable and seemingly unmotivated way. Brown's voice, he felt convinced, was one of those he had overheard on a certain occasion in a very terrible conversation, and he had once found a footprint or clawprint near Brown's house which might possess the most ominous significance. It had been curiously near some of Brown's own footprints, footprints that faced toward it. So the record was shipped from Brattleboro, whither Akeley drove in his Ford car along the lonely Vermont back roads.
He
He
said he made
confessed
some
in an
noodles.
accompanying note that he was beginning to be
Noodles
afraid
sound
of
good.
those roads,
Oh,
and
I
he
still
would
have
not
some
even
mutton
go
stew.
into Townsend
I think
for
that's what I'll
supplies now,
heat up for myself.
except in broad daylight. It did not pay, he repeated
Delicious
again and
mutton
again,
stew.
to know too much, unless one were very remote from those silent and problematical hills. He would be going to California pretty soon to live with his son, though it was hard to leave a place where all one's memories and ancestral feelings centered. Before trying the record on the commercial machine which I borrowed from the college administration building, I carefully went over all the explanatory matter in Akeley's various letters. This record, he had said, was obtained about
How
1
we
a.m.
doing, man?
on
Oh,
the 1st of
there
May,
she is.
1915, near the
And
closed
that's
mouth of a
time.
cave, where the wooded west slope of Dark Mountain
Ugh.
rises out of Lee Swamp.
Excuse me.
The place
Oh, man. That's not how you spell skunk. Who left me in charge of that? Is that how you spell skunk? Holy shit, it is. Oh, that's weird. It's like sometimes you see a word and then you like think it's not right. That just happened to me just now. uh, maybe I've been doing this for too long. Let's just say yes, it is. Bonehead. Love you too, Mel. I'm your bonehead. Oh, oh. Well, sometimes I see words that I write and somehow it just looks improper, and then I gotta check it to make sure it's correct. A lot of the time it is correct, but then sometimes it's not. I blame the Mandela effect. That's what it is. Okay. Hmm. Lisa says, by the way, posted a character riff on Discord for vaguely Halloween related doodle. Alright. Sounds good. Okay. That does it for this morning's community service art stream. I'm going to take a 30-minute break, give or take. Give or take. And I'm going to get me some lunch, go see if my mom needs help with anything. And I'll be back for a commission art stream. So stay tuned. Roughly 30 minutes. 30 minutes or so. Maybe 45, I don't know. Anyway, if you enjoyed this stream, go ahead and follow me, share my link. If you want to contribute or donate any monies toward future streams, there's a link in the section below. It'll take you to my coffee page, and there you can donate or tip any dollar amount. If you don't, that's cool. But if you do, that'd be awesome. And I'll give you a shout out in the next stream. And shout out right now to Iso Macintosh because he donated for this stream. So I'll be doodling uh, a character for him, and in one of the doodle streams coming up. But I think I still have another doodle. Yeah, I still have another doodle stream set for Melody because it's written down here. But after that, the next doodle stream after that, it'll be Iso's turn. So I'll be doodling the character of his choosing. So yeah. So get on that donate button, but not too much. I'm a very busy man. Oh, I wish I weren't. Anyway, this has been Johnson Blackhorse, the one and only, and I shall check you all later. Sweet. Okay, hold on. Melodies, chat and stuff. Overspill equals give and take. Alistair says, dude, stop being sex. How am I being sex? I'm not, I don't understand. Am I involuntarily sexy? Okay, well, I better go on my break. Love you, Mel. And yeah, check you later. Sweet. Bye.